Having watched the flight of the Arctis Minor along with the crew, Martina was content with her time at the settlement and called her shuttle to take her away. With the ship gone, the settlement got on with their work, safe now in the knowledge that the Arctis Minor was protected from local threats. Given that Brom and Gardner's red-haired, bold-cut little son was now running around the colony, they thought it was time to give him a name, and after a brief discussion, they settled on Kitsumi. With the ship now in orbit, Jay wasted no time in planning out the expansions that would allow him to develop the ship's heat dissipation systems, along with its firepower. He began with planning out a couple of nacelles at the rear of the ship, which had enough space to house tanks of coolant, radiators, and weaponry too. Given the slow speed with which they were gaining resources, he would of course be focusing on filling out one at a time. Jason realised that he'd accidentally flown away with the two advanced components that the ground crew would need to make their own fabrication bench. Taking a break from his construction tasks, he decided to give the shuttle its maiden voyage and bring the components back to the settlement. Although he'd mostly just been excited to make the trip for the first time, Samini thought it was silly that he made the whole journey just to drop off the components, so she offered him one of her recent sculptures to take back to the ship with him. Touched by the kindness of the offer, Jay happily agreed and loaded the wooden sculpture onto the shuttle and returned to the Arctis Minor. Given that the artwork depicted an image of Terciel crafting the advanced components that they needed to build the Arctis Minor, it felt like a fitting piece for the ship, so he set it up in his bedroom, to help keep him motivated in his mission. Since he was on the topic of making his living situation more palatable, Jay also rearranged the comfy armchairs in the ship, so that he could fit a table between them where he could sit down and enjoy his meals. He also elected to use some of the spare wood on board to create a chess table, to help keep his mind active. Back on the ground, with their primary purpose now being to create the materials needed to expand the ship, they began training up more of their number in the use of deep drills. The main limiting factor to the build speed was likely to be how long it took them to extract the required resources from beneath the planet's surface. With things going well, Shiro decided to throw a party for the ground crew, just as an excuse for them to have the opportunity to relax and spend some time together. It was quite well attended and went on for many hours, leaving everyone feeling a little better connected and happier. Charging Signal had begun to produce toxic waste packs that the group would need to dispose of properly, to avoid causing damage to the area around the settlement. Until they could dispose of them safely, they would need a place to store them in sub-zero temperatures, to prevent them from decaying. This would be especially important if the group continued to expand the commander's retinue of Mechanoids as they planned. To this end, they added an extension to the mech lab where they could store the frozen waste. Although things were generally going well, a mech cluster had dropped in a few clicks from the settlement and set up a psychic emanator which was wreaking havoc with the mental stability of the crew. It started with Kelsier going catatonic in the chicken coop. While the chickens saw their opportunity and swept in to steal the food she'd dropped, Gardner carried her to safety. Next up was Brom, who, never one to be outdone by Kelsier, decided that it was time for her to also enter catatonic state. With both of them out of action, Gardner decided it was finally time to take action, and totally not because it was now affecting his wife. He called Terciel over and they both hopped into the truck and headed out to deal with the issue. They hoped they could handle it without engaging the Mechanoid, as the two of them, lightly armoured as they were, likely wouldn't last long against any number of Mechanoids. They arrived at the site a little later that evening and managed to skirt the dormant Mechanoids in their truck. They parked up to the rear of the facility and managed to pry open the back door. They held their breath as they began firing upon the psychic droner. To their great relief, it seemed the Mechanoids were not programmed to respond to sound, only movement within their proximity, which the guys had just managed to avoid. With a bit of concentrated gunfire, they were soon able to destroy the droner. They even chanced entering the facility to collect some of the scrap from the wreckage, before jumping in the van and escaping the area, masterfully avoiding a confrontation with the Mechanoids. Not long after the guys arrived back at the settlement, Gardner's first new friend was ready, a Minotaur he had gestating in the mech lab. Minotaurs were small, with no real armour, and only had a basic shotgun. But their basic nature meant that the commander, even with his relatively basic implant, could control a decent number of them. Speaking of Mechanoids, the clusters near the base were showing off their downside. As well as potentially handling some raiders, they also didn't take kindly to visitors who were friendly to the rebels. But the rebels weren't going to just abandon these visitors. As one ran from the area leaving his friend behind, Ben snuck out of the south gate of the settlement to scoop up the other and deliver him to the group's hospital for treatment. The commander had originally envisaged turning the Arctis Minor into a colony ship, where they could all live whilst also fighting back against the Empire. But as he spent more time at the settlement, he began to see the major benefits of having a planetary port. It offered them an opportunity to engage with other factions around them, which could be used to drum up support for their movement. It also allowed them trade opportunities, as well as access to troves of underground resources for building their fleet. Perhaps most importantly, it served as a safe refuge where they could retreat and where their children could grow up in nature, instead of spending their whole lives only knowing the inside of a ship. As such, he had decided that the settlement would stay, and that they would instead turn the Arctis Minor into a specialised fighter ship, designed purely to wreak havoc on enemy ships, whilst the settlement provided all of the supporting needs, such as food, fuel, and soldiers. With this in mind, rescuing the visitor would do wonders with helping them to build an alliance with the other nearby factions, which would help solidify their position on this planet. As an exotic goods trader passed overhead, the group realised that they had sent their only comms console into space aboard the Arctis Minor. With a sigh, the commander asked Brom to build him a new one, this time in the classroom. It may seem like an odd choice of location, but many of the children like to spend time on the comms console during their playtime, so it would make sense to have it in the classroom so they could all learn together. With the chicken population exploding once more, it wasn't long before the pen started struggling to keep up with their demands for food, not helped by the fact that it was the dead of winter. Since the settlement still had an abundance of free space, Kelsier suggested simply increasing the size of the pen, allowing it to encompass more of the green space and thus sustain a larger number of animals. Of course, given their explosive growth potential, population control in the form of Hot Wings Wednesday would still be required. Of course, it was never going to be long before another group of raiders turned up, but much to the squad's happiness, this group were lightly armed and lightly armoured. They took up their usual defensive positions along the barricades at the main entrance to the settlement, but with the commander eager to put his new Mechanoid friend through his paces, he had it take point to draw the attacker's fire, whilst also allowing it to get close enough to utilise its short-range shotgun. With the combination of heavy fire from the squad and the turrets, the attackers didn't last long under the barrage, and after most had fallen, the remaining few turned tail and ran. A large group of herders approached the settlement, but the commander's excitement at maybe being able to offload a bunch of his chickens is soon cut short as the herders get engaged by the mech cluster to the west of the settlement. The commander tries to rush out to do business with them before they can fall, but he isn't quite fast enough. To make matters worse, as this is unfolding, a message comes in across the comms console from a local group who've managed to retrieve Tavy, but are demanding their payment before they'll drop him off. The squad don't quite have enough to cover the cost, although they would have had plenty if they'd managed to sell some chickens to the herders. To their credit, the herders do a lot of damage to the Mechanoids before they fall, leaving only 2 lancers and a single turret left. They also happen to leave most of their goods adorning their corpses. Although the turret still poses a danger, the commander readies his little buddy's signal, and they sally forth from the south exit of the settlement. Weaving their way between trees as a form of cover, they approach one of the bodies which had a large amount of silver on it. Signal rushes in to grab the silver, taking only a few light hits from the turret in return. After a fraught retreat, they've managed to increase the size of their coffers enough to pay for Tavy's bounty, and the bounty hunters happily drop pod him back to the settlement, patched up and ready to see his friends once more. The group had noticed a horrific snail-like creature stalking the chicken pen. They consulted some files on local wildlife, which revealed it to be a plasmorph, a large mutant creature capable of creating an electrical discharge to incapacitate its prey or attackers. Thankfully, it didn't quite match the range of an SMG, and Terce was happy to work out some of his anger whilst also defending the chickens. Although the chameleon drive could protect the Arctis Minor from detection, that did nothing to deter asteroid damage, and Jay was rudely interrupted one evening by a small field of asteroids slamming against the hull. It seems as though the ship had drifted into an asteroid field. Jay performed a quick burn of the engines to move the ship away from the danger, taking only a few small hits to the hull in the process. The collisions thankfully didn't breach the hull, but it would require some patching up. The Mechanoids in this region must have registered the settlement as a high-tech area whilst the ship was here, and not re-evaluated since it left, as they seemed to be drawn to the settlement like a magnet. This next group brought a defoliator with them, which would slowly kill off all plant life in an ever-expanding radius. As was somewhat the policy of the time, the squad elected to ignore this group of Mechanoids, until such time as their equipment or their circumstances made removing them less of a dangerous prospect. Of course, the constant Mechanoid menace had its uses too, proven again when the group finally get around to breaking down the siege breaker that the herders had destroyed, freeing up a nice chunk of components, steel and plasteel. Overjoyed to have Tavy back safely had Kelsier appreciating the joys in life, and she decided she wanted to solidify that joy and asked Tavy to marry her, but she was only too happy to agree to. As the happy couple celebrated, Terce began to wonder if they'd made a mistake putting the bounty out for Tavy's return. Tavy was back to his usual defence-oriented mind, and suggested adding a few columns of stone to their defences, to provide them with better cover than the current barricades could. At the same time, he suggested that they clear all the trees in the entryway to remove any cover attackers could use. Jay was making regular trips back to the settlement, both to gather up more materials but also just to say hi to his friends and get a bit of social interaction. This was often facilitated by Signal, who would stay to load the shuttle whilst Jay enjoyed a meal with the others. His most recent trip was a bit fraught though, as a number of the other rebels were struck down with malaria. Jay managed to avoid it though and made a hasty retreat back to the ship to avoid contracting it, in case the mosquitoes were still around. Thankfully, due to their fancy new hospital, the illness posed little real risk to those infected, and instead just laid them up in bed for a few days whilst they underwent treatment. With another 3 groups of raiders approaching the settlement, and given their small size, it seemed initially like this would be an easy defence for the rebels. To their humour, one of the groups even ended up engaging with the mech cluster to the north on their way in, getting themselves evaporated in the process. Unfortunately, prior to their evaporation, the group managed to take out the last 2 turrets of the cluster, leaving the Tesseron and the Siege Melter untethered from the cluster and free to launch their own attack against the settlement. And so it was that, after having left their posts, assuming the job was already done, the rebels had to scramble back to the defences to take care of the Mechanoids too. With both the Tesseron and the Siege Melter utilising heat-based weaponry, it could prove a disaster for the rebels, but they had an ace up their sleeve. The commander had by this point managed to create 3 Militors, which they would send forward into the entryway. Although the Militors' damage against the mechs would be minimal, they were much less susceptible to fire than humans. And as such, they could draw the fire of the larger Mechanoids whilst the rebels rained down hell on them from the defences. The Tesseron went down with little difficulty, but the siege melter was a different matter. It was a living tank, which could spray near constant spouts of fire across large swathes of land. Thankfully for the rebels, their tactic held, and the Militars were able to keep the siege melter's attention, while, over the course of a few hours, the rebels managed to take it apart from a distance. In the end, the squad avoided injury, but one of the Militars lost its life, and the entryway to the settlement was a barren, fire-scarred hellscape. Returning to the Arctis Minor with a shuttle loaded to the brim with materials, Jay momentarily decompresses one of the rooms to enable him to fit a new airlock between it and the newly created nacelle. With the first new room constructed and ready to be filled, he begins constructing a coolant tank to considerably increase the ship's heat capacity. He also creates the ship's first weapon, a plasma cannon, giving it a basic ability to defend itself. Of course, as one Mechanoid cluster is dealt with, another appears. This one is slightly more problematic as it features an auto mortar, which will begin launching mortar shells at the settlement once it awakens in 14 days' time. The arrival of this cluster and the inevitable confrontation that it will force the rebels into finally forces the commander to set Jay to researching how to make armour for the group, starting with some basic plate armour, with the intention of figuring out more complex armours afterwards. With the Militars proving their value to the squad during the previous raid, the commander suggests trying to advance their understanding of Mechanoids, so that he can create some more advanced Mechanoids to help them defend the settlement. How will they advance their understanding? By examining a super dangerous advanced Mechanoid, of course. As such, he summons a Diabolus, which arrives in the area, and the squad, eager to avoid it utilising its powerful weaponry against the settlement, exit the settlement to try and engage it. The Diabolus had brought 3 Militars of its own, but so had the commander. Between dodging blasts from the Diabolus' powerful Hellseer cannon, the squad focused their fire on the Militars first, to enable them to give the Diabolus their full attention. Thankfully, the light armour of the Militars meant that they went down quite quickly. With them out of the way, the commander once again sent his Militars in close to draw the Diabolus' attention, this time ensuring that some of them engaged in melee combat to stop it using its guns against the squad. The Diabolus stuck bashing away at the nearby Militars, the group were soon able to bring it down, revealing the signal chip they would need to advance their study. In a sudden and shocking turn of events, Tavy called things off with Kelsier before they could be married. Neither of them were willing to reveal much about what had happened to the rest of the squad, but it did put a bit of a dampener on everyone's moods. One of the local factions that were friendly to the rebels got in touch with them to request their help. A group of 5 Impids were ambushing the faction's caravans, and they were willing to pay the rebels to deal with the Impids for them. The commander was still intent on getting better armour for his people to help protect them, so the offer of a prestige spider fract helmet was too good to turn down. Besides, how much trouble could 5 Impids cause them? Although it was a far cry from the armour he hoped to eventually outfit them with, the commander figured that, if they were deliberately riding out to a fight, it would make sense for them to at least have plate armour, so between himself and Terciel, they crafted 2 helmets and 2 sets of plate armour for whoever would end up attacking the Impids. With Tavy now kicked out of the room he shared with Kelsier and sleeping on the floor of the workshop, Brom suggested that they add a new set of rooms in the settlement, although she was sure to suggest that it was actually to house the kids once they grew up, eager to spare Tavy any embarrassment. With the armour sets ready and eager to give Tavy a break from moping around the settlement, Gardner suggested that the two of them handle the Impid bandits together. Aside from anything else, Tavy was their security expert, so he would be helpful to have on hand once the shooting started. Feeling perhaps a tad overconfident in their armour with their SMGs, facing off against a group of tribal Impids armed with sharp stones and bows, Gardner and Tavy forwent cover in favour of just blasting away at the Impids. Tavy did end up taking quite a few hits, but in fairness to their armour, only one of the hits led to any blood loss, the rest were just exceedingly painful bruises. After patching up Tavy, the commander did a quick sweep of the encampment to see if there was anything valuable, but aside from a few sleeping rolls, there was nothing of significant interest, so he packed up the truck and they headed back to the settlement. Unfortunately, while on the trip home, Gardner noticed that the wound that had drawn blood on Tavy had become infected, so he rushed home to get Tavy into the hospital for treatment as quick as he could. Given the squad's reliance on deep drills for resource collection, it was only a matter of time before the squad ran afoul of some insectoids, and sure enough, a hive started to burrow up below the hill to the south of the base. Not wishing to give them a chance to get a foothold and start reproducing, a few of the squad, flanked by the commander's Militors, ventured out to the opening of the cave in the hill and began luring the bugs out, shredding them with a hail of bullets as soon as they appeared. With deadly efficiency, they completely cleared the hive in moments. With their stockpiles reaching capacity and the workshop becoming more and more congested with different workbenches, Brom suggested that they add a little extra storage to the area, to allow them to continue to hoard resources that they might sell to passing traders. With the main limiting factor to increasing the Arctis Minor's firepower and heat capacity being advanced components, Jay figured he could utilise the steel and plasteel they had to start construction of the second nacelle, starting with adding the airlock this time. One of the local factions which had been hostile to the rebels invited them to peace talks not far from the settlement. Eager to try and make peace if he could, the commander agreed to travel out and meet them. He also took Tavy with him though, just in case things took a violent turn. Unfortunately, it seemed the commander had overestimated his negotiation skills, and although the meeting didn't get violent, they were no closer to peace. He did at least feel like he gained a better understanding of how to handle such situations in the future though, so I guess that's a small silver lining? That night, before the commander and Tavy returned, the squad were awoken to the sounds of explosions as a mortar round from the Mechanoid cluster tore through the roof of the workshop. It seemed it had finally activated. Not daring to attack the cluster and its multitude of turrets without the commander and his mechs, the squad tried to continue life, dodging the occasional mortar round and hoping for the best. Whether due to stress or something else entirely, Kelsier decided to try hitting on Terciel. But it seemed that their long and complicated past was too much for him to get over, and he turned her down. The commander and Tavy returned, looking forward to climbing into their beds after a long day, but Tavy was soon alerted to the fact that a restful night's sleep might not be on the cards. With his Militors in tow, the commander approached the cluster from the cover of a large meteorite which had landed nearby, and would obscure him from the turret's vision as they approached. His mission in this outing was not to completely remove the cluster, but merely to remove the mortar, so that they could go back to ignoring the cluster without it damaging the settlement. He sent the Militors in first, to distract the turrets and maybe even try and take some of them out, while he kept his distance and focused on the mortar. With the sheer number of turrets in the cluster, the Militors were themselves soon disposed of, and after an unfortunate strike from the Inferno cannon set him alight, forcing him out of his cover, the mini-slugger turret sent Gardner to the ground in quick order. As the one with the longest range weapon of the group, Kelsier ventured out into the field to try and finish the job, and, with a few well-placed shots, managed to take out the mortar. The ensuing explosion put the Militors to rest, but they could always be resurrected. Assuming the commander survived, that is. While Kelsier had been dealing with the mortar, Vin had attempted to rescue the commander, but hadn't gotten far before she too was knocked down, leaving the squad with 2 injured in an active fire zone. On her way back to the settlement, Kelsier scooped up Vin, whilst Tavy, armoured as he was, ran out to grab the commander. Once out of range of the turrets, Kelsier tended Vin in the field as her injuries were quite drastic. In the end, they all escaped with their lives, but a bit of time in the hospital was likely for all involved. Deciding that they hadn't been using their burn room all that effectively, and that simply leaving the bodies of their enemies outside the settlement as a warning to others worked just as well, they tore down the old burn room and extended the mech lab into it, allowing more room for the commander to start creating more dangerous allies for them. In order to make advanced mechanoids, they would require a scan of a human brain, and as Tavy was their expert on weapons, he made the most sensible choice to scan in order to create advanced combat mechanoids. Having heard rumours of an ancient Mechanitor facility near the settlement, Gardner and Tavy set off to investigate it. They had no interest in making any of the other rebels into Mechanitor, but they figured a high-tech facility might have some materials they could scavenge. Upon arriving, they performed a thorough sweep of each room, until they encountered an unstable fuel node that was set to blow. Trying to get away from the blast, they noticed only too late that there was a dormant Mechanoid in the next room. The fuel node blast awoke the mech, which charged after the pair, adding to the inferno by spraying fire at Tavy, whilst a second Mechanoid appeared from the other room to box them in. It was a tense situation, but Gardner managed to put down one of the Mechanoids whilst the pair's movements confused the other. Spotting an opportunity, they escaped to a further room, but the other Mechanoid chased them. At close quarters it was very ineffective, so Tavy engaged it in melee whilst Gardner let off blasts of his shotgun. They managed to take it down, but with the air in the room becoming superheated, it was only a matter of moments before their lungs got cooked. They began blasting a hole in the wall so they could escape into the cool freshness of the night, with Gardner carrying the injured Tavy out on his shoulders before tending to his wounds. As the commander and Tavy were orchestrating their close escape, a large group of raiders approached the settlement, eager to take advantage of the commander's absence and the squad's inability to utilise their own mechanoids. Despite the lack of the squad's own mechanoids, however, the awakened cluster to the north was still intent on killing anything that moved, and it started laying into the raiders. Surprisingly, despite their primitive weapons, the raiders' overwhelming numbers meant they actually managed to dismantle the cluster. Brom radioed the commander and he rushed to throw Tavy back in the truck and head back to the settlement as fast as the truck would allow. With the raiders biding their time before they attacked, Kelsier spotted an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. The raiders were stationed next to the still dormant mechanoids that had arrived with the defoliator. Kelsier snuck out with her long-range rifle and with one masterful shot, hit the defoliator ship, waking the mechanoids, who immediately identified the raiders as a threat and began attacking them. Kelsier managed to escape just before the raiders caught her, and as planned, the raiders and the mechanoids began an all-out war. As their fight was progressing, the commander and Tavy arrived back. Sneaking the truck into the settlement from the south, they got themselves prepared to face whoever the victor of the fight in the north was. Once again, despite the technological disadvantage, the raiders seemed to be doing well enough, although in the end, the Mechanoids won out. However, just as the squad were preparing to deal with the single remaining Mechanoid, yet another group of raiders appeared. This group was quite small, but a lot were equipped with grenades, which were extremely dangerous. It seemed the universe itself was testing them, however, as at that moment, one of their deep drows seemed to have angered another hive of insectoids, which were poised to erupt inside the hospital. Shiro grabbed the hospitalised Samony and they all left the hospital, leaving the doors open to allow them a clear line of sight to fire upon the hive once they emerged. The infestation was blessedly small, and with the help of a couple of tribal traders who were in the area, the squad dealt with the infestation with no real issue. Just as they were about to take up their defensive positions to combat the raiders, they realised that at some point a hole had been blown in the north wall of the settlement, allowing the raiders to simply waltz in. Without being able to slow them down, it was going to be imperative that the squad took out the raiders quickly, before they could deploy too many grenades. Thankfully, the raiders who entered from the north were small in number. The squad were able to blast most of them away, whilst the friendly traders at the entryway dealt with the raiders who made their way to the front of the settlement. It cost the traders dearly as they were outmatched technologically, but they eventually managed to take out the attacking forces. With the immediate threats dealt with, Shiro ventured out to destroy the defoliator ship in the north, allowing the squad to claim the abandoned mortars that had been left there during the siege. And with that, for the first time in years, the area around the settlement was entirely free of Mechanoids. It wasn't likely to last, but the squad were finally able to breathe and bask in their success. Vin even threw a party to help everyone celebrate. Hey guys, Tuna here. Thank you so much for watching. I'm having a lot of fun making this series, so I really hope you're enjoying it too. With the decision to keep the settlement as a permanent part of the rebellion going forward, I do feel like it needs a good name instead of just referring to it as the settlement. So if you have any suggestions for what we should call it, let me know down in the comments below. A massive thank you to the Patreons, as always. You'll help keep me super motivated on this weird little YouTube journey I'm on. I shall be back with episode 4 in 2 weeks. Make sure to subscribe to see that when it comes out. And until then, I hope whatever you have planned for the next 2 weeks turns out super well and that you have just a really wonderful time. Okay, until next time, bye bye!